Did you know? There were 7 different versions of Pokemon Gold and Silver, and it took almost 3 years from when Gen 2 first launched in Japan until the games finally made their way all around the world. They were ultimately translated into English, French, German, Spanish, Italian, and even Korean. Each localization featured some unique details, with regional differences starting before you even left your house in Newbark Town. In most countries, Mom's TV was playing an anime film, but in France, Mom was watching an 80s B-movie. Some versions had different Pokemon sprites, different buildings, and even some of the people were different. So I hope you'll forgive any mispronunciations on my part as we dig into Pokemon's 2nd generation and take a look at how Gen 2 was changed all around the world. Pokemon Gold and Silver launched in Japan in late 1999 and included lots of Pokemon and trainer sprites that ended up getting changed in the international releases, but we'll get to those in a minute, because the most significant Japan exclusive content was actually in Pokemon Crystal. In every region outside Japan, the Pokemon Center in Goldenrod City was just like any other, but in Japanese versions, Goldenrod was home to the Pokemon Communication Center. By purchasing a $50 attachment called a Mobile Adapter GB and connecting it to a Game Boy Color and a cell phone, Japanese fans could use the communication center to battle and trade Pokemon over the internet. The Pokemon News Machine delivered a monthly publication directly to your Game Boy Color, costing about 10 cents per issue, the same price as each individual battle and trade. That's right, in 2001, Japanese Crystal featured both internet capabilities and microtransactions. The News Machine also provided mini-games, quizzes, and access to online leaderboards that kept track of how many steps you'd taken, battles fought, Pokemon traded, and even the largest Magikarp caught, and ranked players accordingly. You could view the high scores for all of Japan, or you could filter the results down to players in your region or area code, making it easy to see how you stacked up against the kids in your neighborhood. Japanese Crystal could even connect to Pokemon Stadium 2 and download battle data from official tournaments like the Nintendo Cup 2000. You could watch the tournament unfold on your TV, and you could even have an AI opponent take control of one of the tournament goers' Pokemon teams so you could battle against them with your own Pokemon, almost like you were actually part of the tournament yourself. Probably the biggest draw for Crystal's online service was the events it unlocked via DLC. There were downloadable events for items like odd eggs with a high chance of hatching shiny baby Pokemon, as well as events that gave you Japan exclusive items like the Blue Sky Mail and the Mirage Mail. But the most significant DLC event was the one that allowed fans to download the GS Ball, a key item that unlocked a level 30 Celebi in the Ilex Forest. The Celebi event was added back into international versions when Crystal was re-released on Virtual Console in 2018. However, all the other special features were left out, so there was a huge piece of Gen 2 that fans outside Japan never got to experience. Even before Gen 2 released in Japan, Pokemon Company CEO Ishihara was already talking about how he wanted Pokemon games to release in every region all on the same day. But his goal didn't become a reality until 4 generations later, and it ended up taking almost a year to localize Gold and Silver for the American market. Just like in Gen 1, Nintendo of America staffer Hiro Nakamura was responsible for localizing all Gen 2's big words, the ones in all caps, like the names of characters, cities, items, attacks, and of course, Pokemon. Hiro came up with the English names and then sent them to Game Freak and Nintendo's legal department for approval, but in some cases, the names he chose got rejected and had to be changed. Nob Ogasawara was responsible for all Gen 2's small words, comprising about 99% of the game's text. When we asked Nob how he translated Gen 2 differently compared to Gen 1, he told us he made a conscious decision to make the text of Gold and Silver more like Baby's First RPG, where Johto felt like a kid-friendly world full of excitement, scariness, and adventure. So he made the overall tone a bit more magical, and also removed some stuff that wasn't particularly well suited for American kids. For instance, there's a man on Route 2 who gives you a nugget, but in Japanese, nuggets are called golden balls. This appears to be a deliberate dirty joke on Game Freak's part. In Japanese slang, golden balls means testicles, so the man is essentially saying, "Here's an old man's testicles, I hope you put them to good use." This PG-13 joke was repeated in future generations, and even appeared in the Sun and Moon anime. But in English, the joke was nipped in the bud right from the start, with Nob replacing Gen 2's text with a joke about nuggets of wisdom. So even though the old man's balls are a long-running meme in Japan, the joke simply never existed in English, and Knob took it upon himself to make some cultural edits as well, like changing the descriptions of all the Buddhist shrines to identify them as Diglett sculptures, just like he did in Gen 1. But it wasn't just the game's text, there were also some visual differences. 31 Pokemon sprites were altered for the American market, the most famous example of course being Jinx, whose black skin and blonde hair were changed to purple and white due to the racial controversy surrounding Jinx in America. All the other sprites were changed to fix design inconsistencies, like Feraligator's white underbelly and Lantern's yellow spots. In both Gen 1 and 2, Pokemon designers created sprites first, then the art director Ken Sugimori made their official artwork later, often making design revisions as he saw fit. But after Sugimori's revisions, the sprites themselves weren't revised to match the artwork, leaving lots of inconsistencies between the Pokemon's art and sprites. However, most of these inconsistencies were fixed during Gold and Silver's year-long localization process, which is why so many sprites were different in the original Japanese versions compared to the later international versions. Likewise, some sprites were changed for consistency with the anime, like Slowpoke for example. Sugimori's artwork never revealed what Slowpoke's belly looked like, so in Japan it was white, but in the West it was later changed to pink to match Slowpoke's anime appearances. The same can be said for Teddiursa's feet and Donphan's trunk. 5 trainer sprites were changed as well, but for cultural reasons. Fishers had their cigarettes taken away, mediums had their religious beads confiscated, and sages' folded prayer hands were changed to crossed arms. Female swimmers and beauties were made just a little less sexy. In Japan, they were winking, but in America, their eyes were pried back open, and beauties had about 12 inches of extra material sewn onto their skirts. The final results of the localization process was that the English versions of Gen 2 were more kid-friendly, and featured sprites that looked more like the Pokemon they represented. And of course, all the online features were unfortunately stripped out as well. Just like in Gen 1, the European versions of Gen 2 were all based on the English localization. In other words, they were translations of a translation, 2 steps removed from the original source material. But unlike in America, Europe had an almost entirely new team of translators. There were 15 translators in total, but only 3 of them had been around during Gen 1. Julian Bardakov, the lead French translator, was one of those 3. Julian gave us the inside scoop on our Gen 1 video, so we brought him back for this video to tell us how things went down in Gen 2. Early in Gen 1's localization, Game Freak originally wanted Europe to use Pokemon's Japanese names, so Julian had to fight for the right to give Pokemon new French names, for example by telling Game Freak that Squirtle and Charmander's Japanese names sounded like the French slang words for stoner and feces. Game Freak didn't really trust him, but they ultimately gave in, and grudgingly allowed Julian to rename old Gen 1's Pokemon. After Red and Blue launched in France, Julian's translation was so well received by fans and critics alike that Game Freak felt he'd proven himself. So for Gen 2, they were now more than happy to let him create new French names for all the Johto Pokemon. Julian's penchant for injecting mysticism into Pokemon names, his love of movies, and his newfound clout resulted in the French versions featuring more unique differences, more so than any other localization, including English. Julian renamed Misdreavus Fatharev, a reference to Will-o'-the-Wisps from mythology and folk tales all around the world. According to legend, Will-o'-the-Wisps are ghostly lights witnessed by travelers in the night, who get led astray in the hope the lights are a friendly presence carrying a lantern. Julian also renamed Crobat Nostinfair, a combination of Nosferatu and the French word for hell. In fact, he named the entire Zubat family after Nosferatu, the 1922 German horror film about a vampire with a special interest in the wife of his real estate agent. In the Japanese and English versions of Pewter City, you can trade your hunter for a Xatu nicknamed Paul. Julian changed Paul's name to Quetzalcoatl in honor of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent worshipped by some ancient Mesoamerican tribes as the god of wind and wisdom. In every region except France, the TV at your house in Newbarktown is playing Night on the Galactic Railroad, a 1985 anime movie about 2 boys who ride a train into the stars and past Christian heaven. Interestingly, the main character Giovanni was voiced by Veronica Taylor in the English dub, the same actress who played the voice of Ash Ketchum. But in the French version, Julian changed the TV's description so it was showing "Have a drink and take it easy in Saint-Tropez," an 80s French comedy about a girl who tells her parents she's going to Brittany to study, but actually spends her summer partying in the south of France. When we asked Julian why he changed the TV, he said, because it was funny to imagine that kind of B-movie airing on the TV channels of Fantasy Japan. Haha. In fact, Julian said he injected B-movie references into all the games he translated, including Ocarina of Time, Super Mario 64, and Banjo-Kazooie. As we mentioned in our Gen 1 video, the Spanish and Italian translations had fewer staff and a smaller budget, so neither language was ever given unique Pokemon names. Both versions were also plagued with lots of translation errors, and almost all the mistakes made in Gen 1 were carried over into Gen 2, like how Pokemon caught with fishing rods were called evil in Spanish. Also in Spanish, the attack counter was mistranslated to Contador, and in Italian it was mistranslated to Contatori. Rather than a counterattack, both words refer to something that counts, like a water meter or a scoreboard. Italian translator Elena Fogazzaro told us the same mistake was made in both languages because the Spanish translators got it wrong first, then the Italians basically copied their homework. In short, out of all 7 versions, the Spanish and Italian localizations were basically the runts of the litter. Just like in Gen 1, the Germans fulfilled their cultural stereotype, and their localization was efficient and accurate. They didn't use as much imagination as the French, but they also made far fewer errors compared to the Spanish and Italians. But there were a few oddities, like how up until Gen 8, the paralysis-inducing attack Glare was mistranslated to Giftblick, which actually means poison glance, frustrating German players who wanted to poison their enemies but ended up paralyzing them instead. The Germans also renamed Cyndaquil Furygle, which means fire hedgehog. This made some German fans believe that Cyndaquil was a hedgehog, even though the Pokédex actually classifies Cyndaquil as a mouse. The last of the bunch, South Korea, finally got localizations of Gold and Silver in 2002, more than a year after Europe and almost 3 years after the games first launched in Japan. While the European localizations were more similar to the English versions, the Korean localization was closer to the original Japanese releases. In Korea, they used the same sprites as in Japan, even Jinx, and they used all the original trainer sprites as well. Pokemon did get unique Korean names, but they were mostly just direct translations or transliterations of their Japanese names, and didn't feature any references to culture or mythology. But there is one name that stands out. Ho-Oh is called Chilsekjo, which means 7-colored bird, presumably because of the Pokemon's association with rainbows. Unlike every other region's Gold and Silver, the Korean versions could not be played on a Game Boy. Korean text is so complicated that the game's text rendering system actually demands more video RAM to display it than all the other languages, meaning it can only be played on a Game Boy Color. In an even more unfortunate turn of events for South Korea, they never received a localization of Pokemon Crystal at all, and thus never got access to Japan's online features or DLC. But at least South Korea got Gold and Silver. Most regions were neglected entirely. Some of the world's most prominent languages never got any Gen 2 localizations, including Chinese, Hindi, Arabic, and Portuguese. In total, about half the world's population never got to play Gold, Silver, or Crystal because they didn't speak any of the 7 languages the games are translated into. Or more accurately, I should say officially translated into, because there were some bootlegs produced to meet demand in those neglected regions, especially in China, due to their lax laws dealing with intellectual property rights. The most famous of these bootlegs is what fans lovingly refer to as Vietnamese Crystal. These pirated cartridges circulated widely in Vietnam in the early 2000s and are believed to have come into existence when the original Japanese games were illegally translated into Chinese, then later got translated into English. In other words, they were a pirate's translation of a pirate's translation. Vietnamese Crystal famously refers to Pokemon as elves, displays the word f whenever you receive an item, and contains lots of bizarre quotes, like "the tower is built for pocket monsters to practice Buddhism," or "asses is $1,000. Pokemon is the world's largest multimedia franchise after all, and it just goes to show that nature abhors a vacuum, and when it comes to Pokemon, life finds a way.
Did you know? When Game Freak was deciding what kind of Pokemon to make for Gen 6, they were thinking about the Pokemon World Championships. Talking to Nintendo Dream Magazine, they said too many competitors were using the same Pokemon over and over, and the same kind of people kept winning, with series director Junichi Masuda saying, in 2011 and 2012, the junior, senior, and master divisions were all won by Americans, but this time, lots of different nationalities won, which really gave it a sense of being the Pokemon World Championships. They were also excited to see a wider variety of Pokemon getting used competitively. What they weren't as excited about, though, was getting whooped by their own fans. At a one-time event called the Pokemon Game Show in Tokyo, where people got to play X and Y a few months before launch, developers like Shigeki Morimoto battled against fans, including former world champ Ray Rizzo. In the end, the fans won and the developers lost. They even got beat by elementary school kids. Morimoto told Nintendo Dream, "It's true, unfortunately. Absolutely, I was nervous, and the battle stressed me out. I really did want to win." Speaking of the World Championships, if you dig around in X and Y's internal data, you can find a modernized remix of Gen 1's Champion Battle theme. The track never plays anywhere in Kalos. In fact, the only place you could have heard it legit was at the real-life Pokemon World Championships. Most of you didn't attend, so here's a few seconds of the original, compared to the remix. Earlier Pokemon games could take months, even years, to get released around the world. Gold and Silver, for example, launched in Japan in 1999, America in 2000, and Europe in 2001. The Pokemon Company had long sought to streamline the game's translation so that they could sync up a worldwide launch, but it wasn't until X and Y they finally pulled it off.
Coming worldwide, October 12th, 2013.
But why did it matter? According to Masuda, a big reason is the element of surprise. In previous generations, overseas fans would have already seen all the new Pokemon in magazines or online and had story elements spoiled because the games launched in Japan long before they arrived on foreign shores. X and Y contain 800,000 Japanese characters, and localizing them into 7 languages was no easy task. But achieving that feat came at a cost. Masuda said that there were originally some more text-heavy features, but to meet the localization deadline, those features ultimately became cut content. Speaking of which, when most fans picture the devs, they usually think of the director, Pokemon designers, and maybe programmers. The folks who translate the games to different languages all around the world, the localizers, are usually pretty far down that list. But according to Masuda, if it wasn't for Pokemon's French localizers, Kalos wouldn't have been based in France. X and Y's themes are beauty, bonding, and evolution, with a special emphasis on beauty. Kalos could have easily taken after somewhere else beautiful, like California or Italy, but Masuda said, "We chose beauty because we wanted something beautiful on the 3DS. There were several possible regions, but I was impressed by how the localizers who translated the previous games into French were very particular about the beauty of the language. So I decided to base Kalos on France." More specifically, Kalos is based on northern France, as you can see when one map is superimposed over the other. Quite a few real-life locations served as inspiration as well, like Route 10, which is based on the Carnac Stones in France's northwest province of Brittany. Local folklore says these 10,000 rocks stand in straight lines because they're a Roman legion that the Pope turned into stone. Prism Tower is based on the Eiffel Tower. Parfum Palace is the Palace of Versailles, and so on. Some of the Pokemon themselves drew from French culture, in the same way the Unovan Pokemon were inspired by America. In other words, those localizers had a massive, massive impact that'll forever continue into future generations. But that we only got the northern half of France, combined with the fact X and Y added fewer new Pokemon than any previous generation, less than half as many as Gen 5 for example, led some fans to speculate that Pokemon Z would include new areas comprising South Kalos, populated with new species. So naturally, the South Kalos Pokedex leaked online, detailing all the new Pokemon set to appear in the Z version. They were fake, of course, but an interesting part of Gen 6 history nonetheless, which some fans at the time thought might actually be true. Would have been cool if they were, though, honestly. The south of France is famously quite beautiful, and actually a new area like South Kalos wasn't as outlandish as some might think. In fact, it seems the Pokemon Company was strongly considering it, but not in Pokemon Z. Instead, as a DLC. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Gates to Infinity released on 3DS in 2012, the year before X and Y. At launch, it had about 30 dungeons, then a little while later, it got substantial DLC in the form of 12 additional dungeons, plus 24 new music tracks. Soon after, before X and Y even released, a Japanese journalist asked Pokemon Company president Ishihara if X and Y were going to get DLC too. Ishihara said, "You mean like the DLC we made for Pokemon Mystery Dungeon? That's the hardest question you could have asked today, haha. We're considering a lot of things, but I can't give you an answer at this time. If they'd followed through, South Kalos is probably a bit optimistic. 12 new dungeons is probably more equivalent to new islands akin to Kanto's Sevi Islands. The Sevi Islands were based on islands off the coast of real-life Kanto in Japan, and France has some real-life islands as well. Or on the more pessimistic end, maybe a new Battle Frontier. But as we covered in depth in our Z video, Game Freak was busy making other games at the time, like Timbo the Badass Elephant. Ultimately, Gen 6 didn't get any DLC at all, and it wasn't until Gen 8 they started giving us DLC with new areas in Pokemon. Now, to address the meaning of Gen 6, according to Masuda, Pokemon Black and White's theme was polarity. The next games, Black 2 and White 2, had a theme of resonance. We went through all 12 years of Masuda's blog entries to find X and Y's theme, and found it was a bit more complicated, and you might say philosophically deeper than the games that came before. Here's our English translation of a blog he wrote 1 week after Gen 6's release. He said, "The themes are beauty, bonds, and evolution, but there's an even bigger theme. The world is full of wonderful encounters that depend on the circumstances we find ourselves in. If you were born 1 year earlier, you might have made an entirely different group of friends. If your tastes were different, you might have met different people. Suppose, too, that your parents never met. Everyone's life depends on the chance encounters they make. Instead of fighting, these encounters should be opportunities to build a better world together." The titles X and Y came from this idea. The letters suggest lines on an axis. The lines of both letters head in different directions, but there's a point at which they cross paths. I picked these letters with the idea of intersection in mind, the idea of common points we share with one another rather than our differences. Let's create a better world together. I developed these games to express that idea. Put simply, X and Y are the coordinates of a chance encounter, which could unfold in a huge, significant way, and we should take those as opportunities to make the world a better place. Everyone was expecting Pokemon Z would be Kalos' third version, and there were quite a few clues it was originally part of Game Freak's master plan, as we detailed in previous videos. It's worth pointing out, in geometry, in addition to X and Y, there's also a Z-axis, only in three-dimensional spaces, of course. But Gen 6 was the first 3D generation, so it seems like it would have fit nicely with the generation's theme. That theme of intersection and chance encounters is driven home in X and Y's credit song, but only an acoustic version with subtitles is included in the actual games. No words are actually sung. But a version with lyrics does exist in multiple languages, and was first performed in English at the Pokemon Symphonic Evolutions concert in 2014, with Masuda himself as the conductor. In a Japanese interview, Masuda said, "The game also conveys this message, but I thought I could deliver it more directly if I set it to music. That it's a miracle that we were able to meet each other during the 100 or so years we get to live." Out of all 72 Pokemon added in Gen 6, the Phantump family might have the most interesting development. The only non-Japanese Pokemon designer, James Turner, used to work on spin-offs like Pokemon Coliseum and Battle Revolution. He later applied to join Game Freak, hoping he could work on mainline entries. As a part of the audition process, they had him design a Pokemon with a time limit of only 30 minutes. Under pressure, James came up with a ghost tree, which years later, after some revisions, turned into Phantump. James still has a lot of affection for Phantump, and frequently posts new art and video of it on Twitter. The Pokédex says Phantump are possessed by the spirits of children who died when they got lost in the forest. Lore-wise, it draws inspiration from Kodama, which are trees haunted by spirits from Japanese folklore. Anyone who tries to cut down a Kodama tree will have a terrible curse cast upon them. Phantump's plenty interesting as a Pokemon design, but we really bring it up so we can segue into some developers' deleted tweets with behind-the-scenes info the Pokemon Company apparently didn't want made public. In one of those tweets that James Turner deleted, but we archived, he said that he didn't come up with Phantump's lore himself, which was typical of all Kalos Pokemon. Game Freak has a sort of lore specialist who comes up with Pokédex entries and backstories for Pokemon other people drew. In other deleted tweets, he said designers don't get to name the creatures they create, pick their stats, or even their shiny colors. That last one has changed since Gen 6 though. Nowadays designers often do get to design their own shinies. There's one more deleted tweet worth dredging back up, this time from Toshinobu Matsumiya, who was a story writer for over 20 years from Pokemon Yellow all the way to Legends Arceus. After X and Y's launch, he tweeted out the series timeline, saying Generations 1 and 3 take place at the same time, then Gen 2 and 4 happen later. 3 years later, to be exact. That's stated explicitly in Gold and Silver. The events in Black and White happen after that, then finally, Black and White 2 and Pokemon X and Y take place at the very end of the timeline, or at least the end of the timeline at the time of X and Y's release, 2 years after the previous games to be exact, according to Professor Cedric Juniper. Matsumiya later deleted the tweet, as Pokedevs sometimes do when they've revealed too much behind-the-scenes info. Series director Junichi Masuda later threw cold water on fans trying to make sense of Pokemon having a singular timeline at all, saying, it starts to get a little complicated if you pay too much attention to timelines. Like, there might be a professor that appears and it wouldn't make sense at all if we applied that kind of timeline logic, so we try not to apply it too rigorously. Whether or not Pokemon has an official timeline or several timelines, as the guy who wrote the series story over 8 generations, Matsumiya seems he had one clearly defined in his head when he wrote them. Like when someone in Lumio City says Trainer Blue came to study abroad in Kalos, which makes sense if X and Y happen a few years after Red and Blue, but wouldn't make sense a few years before, when he was like a toddler. It's worth noting some versions of Grimsley's concept art said Gen 7 occurs 2 years after Gen 6, and thus X and Y aren't at the end of the timeline anymore. But that particular line got erased when the same art was published in the Alola Region Artworks book. Maybe that was kind of confusing, so here's the timeline summary. Keep in mind this is based on what the developers and games themselves have said, but the canonicity of some elements are still up for debate. We should also mention that the official Japanese Gen 1 Pokédex book says Red and Green take place in 1996, so you can work out the math yourself on what games take place in which year. And now for our last segment, that Pokemon X and Y feature the series' first transgender character. Maybe you've heard that before, but probably not the real story. The character is called Nova, and at the end of her battle, she says, yes, a mere half year ago, I was a black belt. Quite the transformation, wouldn't you say? Black belts are a male-only trainer type, and now Nova's a beauty, who can only be female. According to Legends of Localization, it's even more explicit in the original Japanese version, where Nova says, the power of medical science is awesome, wouldn't you say? Maybe you've heard this before, but have you ever seen Nova in-game with your own eyes? We're willing to bet you haven't, and never seen footage of her either. In fact, we spent hours looking and couldn't find footage of her in any YouTube playthroughs that cover the part of the game where she supposedly resides. You might have seen this photo, which is cut off and off system. As far as we can tell, it's the only image online, and it just gets copy-pasted over and over in viral tweets, trivia videos, and fan wikis. In the past, we've debunked similar occurrences where a random Twitter user created a story out of thin air, then it gets repeated as facts on news sites. Like how anime writer Takeshi Shudo supposedly said Professor Ivy's a lesbian in his book, even though his book never mentions Professor Ivy. By now, you probably see where this is headed, that Nova, the transgender beauty, never actually existed. But actually, she does exist. The point we're really trying to make is she's so thoroughly hidden that 99.9% of players would never encounter her. So hard to find, it seems footage of her has never made its way online until this video. She's in the Battle Maison, and only appears on normal difficulty, which is really like the tutorial, so most fans will only play normal once or never play it at all. Thanks to the Maison's randomized trainer lineup, you've got to beat 15 opponents in a row to even have a chance at seeing Nova. And even then, the odds are 90% you still won't see her. It took us hours of playing and replaying the Battle Maison to finally encounter Nova, and it turns out she has a bit more dialogue. Like, I've recently remade my life completely. I've been reborn as a beauty at last. And if you want to make your dreams a reality, then you have to be completely dedicated. Besides being deeply hidden in X and Y, we should also mention that in German versions, they changed it so Nova says she used to be a Pokemon breeder, who can be either male or female, and thus removing any indication that she's a trans character. Likewise, in the Korean version, she says she used to be a Taekwondo girl. a trainer class that doesn't even exist. Nova was also removed from Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire's Battle Maison in all languages, and replaced with a different beauty named Nohea. Nohea has similar dialogue, but instead of going from black belt to beauty, she's changed from madame to a beauty. In other words, her big transformation is just trying to look younger. And that's the full story of Pokemon's first transgender character, which, as far as we can tell, before today hasn't been told in its entirety. Before we wrap up, one quick addendum. Nova was only the first trans character in the Pokemon games. The real first trans character is much lesser known, and actually appeared 12 years earlier in a Japan-only manga called How I Became a Pokemon Card. The manga's 38th chapter stars Akari, who says he used to be a girl, but lived 13 years as a boy and believes he's a boy, despite Akari's mom making him wear girl clothes and use his girl voice, which he hates. Akari's story was the very last chapter of that manga that was ever made.
In today's episode, we'll be looking at changes in re-releases of Nintendo games. Games are often changed and updated over time, and these changes range anywhere from small bug fixes to a total overhaul of a game's mechanics. This can be done with downloadable patches and DLC, or in the case of the Pokemon franchise, with re-releases of games. The Safari Zone in Pokemon Red and Blue requires a $500 entrance fee to be paid up front, providing the player with access to the park, 30 Safari Balls, and a 500-step limit. If the player is exceptionally careless with their money and runs out of funds to be able to afford this entrance fee, they will unfortunately get stuck. This situation could arise if the player runs out of trainers to fight and has no items to sell. Without funds to enter the park, the player would be halted from progress in the game, as the park contains HM03, Surf, which allows players to travel to Cinnabar Island. With Pokemon Yellow, it seems the developers felt this was a big enough issue to be addressed. As a result, with this release of Yellow, if the player speaks with the Safari Zone worker without the money to enter, he will take pity and allow the player to enter with only a single Safari Ball. This change was made so that players wouldn't find themselves in a position where they'd have to restart the game from the very beginning if they found themselves in the unlikely scenario of having no funds. While this friendly fix was added in Pokemon Yellow, the original text of the attendant telling the player that they can't enter without paying the fee can still be found in the game's data. This wouldn't be the last time a Pokemon game would be updated to fix an oversight. The game Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team and Blue Rescue Team were released together and would connect in an unusual way. One title would go into the Game Boy Advance slot, and the other would go into the Nintendo DS cartridge slot, allowing them to interact. This inventive use of the DS had some unforeseen consequences, however. Due to a programming error in the original Japanese release of Blue Rescue Team, the game would cause any and all save data to be erased from the Game Boy Advance game in the bottom slot if it wasn't Red Rescue Team. In other words, players could lose their save files by attempting to play other Game Boy Advance games between sessions of Blue Rescue Team, if they didn't take out their Game Boy Advance cartridge before booting up Blue Rescue Team. This was clearly a big issue for people making use of the DS's backwards compatibility, and the bug was fixed in all subsequent releases of Blue Rescue Team. Another example of changes made to a re-release of a game can be found in the 3DS Virtual Console version of The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening DX, released more than a decade after the original. Throughout the game, the player has the chance to encounter the Old Broom Lady. When initiating conversation, Link was always met with a hearty Yahoo from the woman. However, in the 2013 Virtual Console re-release, this dialogue was changed to a few different variations like hello and yippee. Legend of Localization author Clyde Mandolin, aka Tomato, speculated that this was changed following the growth of the search engine and internet giant Yahoo, particularly because the phrase in-game is not only the same word, but also appears in the same format as the company's logo, with the lettering in block capitals followed by an exclamation mark. Digital re-releases often face minor changes, with some being more noticeable than others. When publishing some games for Virtual Console, old licensing rights have to be considered and adjusted. Wave Race 64 was one of these games, which held a license with Kawasaki, an engineering company who specialize in motorsports. This included the use of the Kawasaki brand for banner advertisements seen around the barrier of the track. When releasing the game on the Wii Virtual Console, these banners were changed from Kawasaki to Nintendo DS advertisements. This was because the license to show Kawasaki's brand had expired between the game's first release and the digital re-release. However, unlike most altered re-releases, when the game was re-released for a second time on the Wii U Virtual Console, these banners were changed back to Kawasaki-branded advertising. Hello and welcome to Did You Know Gaming Extra. In today's episode, we'll be looking at a number of gaming-related lawsuits. Nintendo is a force to be reckoned with in the gaming industry. That doesn't make them untouchable or above the law. While a lawsuit against a company doesn't necessarily expose them for malicious intent, the reasons behind some charges can demonstrate a small lack of thought or care. When promoting their re-release of Donkey Kong Country Returns for 3DS, the company promoted the title at the Los Angeles Zoo. Their press release claimed that fans will get a chance to spend time with Donkey Kong and some of his friends from the animal kingdom. Throughout the day of the game's launch, May 24, 2013, actor Parker Mills was hired to wear a Donkey Kong outfit in the park. While this should have been a simple acting gig, Mills was denied the chance to take any breaks throughout the day, and wasn't given any of the required ice packs or even cold drinks to cool him down in the suit. This was particularly harsh, as he would be entertaining guests under the sweltering Southern Californian sun. Unsurprisingly, legal action was taken against Nintendo. The lawsuit alleged that the company's ambassador at the event, who escorted, oversaw, and instructed Mills for the day, failed to provide the proper care for their client. Mills's legal representatives say that as a result, their client suffered from an aortic dissection, the tearing of aortic walls. This meant that the actor had to go through a surgery which implanted a permanent heart defibrillator. Strangely, this wouldn't be the last time Nintendo had a case against them relating to the negligent handling of an actor. In fact, it's not the last time that it would involve a Donkey Kong costume. In 2016, Nintendo hired Michael O'Conatrillo to suit up at a mall in Culver City, California. O'Conatrillo claims that, while the suit was poorly ventilated and unreasonably and dangerously hot, he was under strict orders not to remove the costume. Michael claims that by doing so he has suffered mental and emotional distress, as well as permanent damage, though the lawsuit he filed doesn't mention any specific injuries. Nintendo has even had legal issues with Donkey Kong in his digital form in the past. Ikegami Shushinki, a Japanese manufacturing company who operated a video game division in the mid-80s, helped Nintendo create their arcade release of the original Donkey Kong. Ikegami Shushinki held a contract with Nintendo for the programming and manufacture of numerous arcade titles, including Donkey Kong, with Shigeru Miyamoto giving the company ideas and character designs to be put into the game. This contract meant that Ikegami Shushinki would have the exclusive rights for producing the Donkey Kong arcade boards, a clause which Nintendo ignored, producing their own boards to keep up with the unexpected high demand for the game. Nintendo hired another company, Iwasaki Engineering, to reverse engineer the game to produce a sequel. This was because, as the game was originally produced by Ikegami, Nintendo didn't have a copy of the original source code for Donkey Kong in their possession. Ikegami Shushinki believed that Nintendo violated their contractual agreement over the game's ownership, claiming that Ikegami held ownership over the Donkey Kong code. In response, Nintendo filed an injunction against the company in 1983. In retaliation, Ikegami filed a lawsuit against Nintendo regarding both Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr., a case which would go on until 1990, when a court decided that Nintendo did not own the original Donkey Kong arcade code. The two companies would go on to settle out of court, and despite the ruling, the arcade release of Donkey Kong would see two ports, one in Donkey Kong 64's Frantic Factory, and again as its own release on the Nintendo Switch under the Arcade Archives banner. Speaking of the Switch, the device itself is at the heart of its own lawsuit. In August 2017, GameVice, previously known as WikiPad Inc., claimed that Nintendo has infringed on their patent for their Joy-Con controllers. The patent, which was filed in 2012, relates to a pair of control modules which connect with a separate and distinct digital device. This patent was granted and served as the basis for their WikiPad, an Android tablet with its own detachable controllers which released in 2013 to mixed reviews. While looking to recoup damages from Nintendo, GameVice is also seeking out an injunction against the game's publisher, which will prevent Nintendo from continuing to sell the Switch itself. Their reasoning is that the sale of the Switch has caused and is continuing to cause damage and irreparable injury to GameVice. Most courts demonstrate a reluctance for injunctions against patent-related sales, meaning that such a move would be unlikely to play out, even if to prevent the sale of a product that directly competes with their own. While GameVice's WikiPad product is no longer manufactured and sold in stores, the company itself has since moved on to creating game controller peripherals for other mobile devices, such as phones and tablets, granting some gravity to their claims of damages from a competitor making use of their patent. Nintendo encountering legal battles with their peripherals is also nothing new. In 1991, Nintendo and Toys R Us faced a lawsuit looking for $10,000 in damages when Nicole Abruzzi received medical attention for carpal tunnel syndrome, a form of repetitive strain injury. Abruzzi would spend several hours a day for several weeks playing video games, in particular using the NES light gun controller to play Duck Hunt. While her issues lessened after she stopped playing the game, she would still feel numbness when trying to perform basic actions such as typing or carrying bags of shopping. Her legal team argued that the game should have been designed differently, or at least had a warning attached to the product which informed the customer of the potential for injury. This was one of the earliest cases of a claim against a company for strains relating to video games, coining the name Nintenditis.
Hello and welcome to Did You Know Gaming Extra. In this episode we'll be looking at some controversies relating to Nintendo. We're sure you guys know we love Nintendo as much as the next YouTube trivia channel, but that doesn't mean they don't miss the mark from time to time. And when we say controversy, we're not just talking about game releases that weren't up to the standards of Nintendo players, we're talking about the moments where oversights and a lack of quality assurance left the company looking a bit silly, or worse. This first story comes from back in 2008, but relates to a game from 2005. Kotaku editor-in-chief, Stephen Totilo, was sent a copy of Animal Crossing Wild World during his tenure with MTV. The game wasn't sealed, but had been sent to Stephen by Nintendo, alongside a letter encouraging him to use this copy of Wild World so that he could import all of the save files, unlocked items and characters for the newly released Animal Crossing City Folk on the Wii. Now it's important that we acknowledge first and foremost that the player is able to teach villagers in Animal Crossing games new words and phrases, for example, giving them new greetings for the player. It seems that with regards to this copy of the game, whoever had spent their time running through the game collecting items for the press to make use of, taught their villagers some rather controversial phrases. The example supplied by Stephen was when he was approached by the brown sheep villager Barbara, who said to him, "Heart you long time, how are you, N-word?" Whilst censored in Stephen's photo at the time, it's clear that the first line is a reference to Full Metal Jacket, while the noun used to refer to the player has been written with accented characters to circumvent the censoring of explicit words coded into the game. How these two phrases wound up in a copy of the game that not only came out of Nintendo's press offices, but was even sent to a member of the mainstream gaming press is a bit perplexing. Additionally, Stephen confirmed with then Kotaku editor Brian Crescente that he too had received a copy with similar player-added dialogue. Nintendo commented on the mix-up, explaining that the user-generated catchphrases were added to the game without their knowledge via wireless communication. They also said, "We sincerely apologize for the incident and are working with media who received the game cards to return them to Nintendo immediately." This isn't the only time that Nintendo found themselves in hot water with this sort of language. In April of 2015, Nintendo of America wrote a tweet accompanied by a photo of a Waluigi plush toy riding a Wiggler with a body of text reading, "Reply for #Waluigi Wednesday, reply flower emoji for #Wigger Wednesday." Of course, this is not what they had in mind, having accidentally missed the L from the Wiggler's name. The response from followers of the Nintendo account were mostly that of confusion. Ultimately, the tweet was deleted and Nintendo issued an apology. This didn't stop the hashtag from becoming a minor trend across Twitter, however. And if you didn't already know, Wigger is a derogatory term for a white person who tries to emulate the culture of black people, specifically African American culture. It seems Nintendo often finds themselves in trouble for their choice of words. In 2014, Tomodachi Life was making its way into people's households, allowing players to live a second life on their Nintendo 3DS. A fan-created petition made the rounds after Nintendo refrained from including the choice of sexuality. In particular, this petition requested the inclusion of gay marriage. Nintendo actually chose to respond to this petition. However, it was not particularly well received. Nintendo stated, "Nintendo never intended to make any form of social commentary with the launch of Tomodachi Life. The relationship options in the game represent a playful alternate world rather than a real-life simulation. We hope that all of our fans will see that Tomodachi Life was intended to be a whimsical and quirky game, and that we were absolutely not trying to provide social commentary. The ability for same-sex relationships to occur in the game was not part of the original game that launched in Japan, and that game was made up of the same code that was used to localize it for other regions outside of Japan. We have heard and thoughtfully considered all the responses. We will continue to listen and think about the feedback. We are using this as an opportunity to better understand our consumers and their expectations of us at all levels of the organization. We have been looking to broaden our approach to development whenever possible, as we put all of our energy into continuing to develop fun games that will surprise and delight players. With continued backlash from fans, the company furthered their statement soon after. They claimed that it wouldn't be possible to include same-sex marriage through a post-launch patch, but that they would strive to create a more inclusive title within the Tomodachi franchise in the future. They said, "We pledge that if we create a next installment in the Tomodachi series, we will strive to design a gameplay experience from the ground up that is more inclusive and better represents all players." The issue is seen as divisive across Japan and the Western world, with localization being the most prominent issue. In parts of America and Europe, gay marriage is legal, but even now, this opportunity is not available to Japanese citizens, though the recognition of gay partnerships is gaining public support as time goes on. How a company communicates with their audience can draw a lot of reactions, particularly when the choice to speak on something is optional. But one of Nintendo's products was entirely about communicating bluntly with its users. Wii Fit. The game was created to help players control their body weight and health, providing exercise routines and charts to track progress towards getting that sick bod we all want. It isn't so easy for some of us though. Experts on the topic of obesity went after Nintendo in 2008 because of how it communicates information to its users through Wii Fit, particularly when its users are young. The game was scrutinized for being potentially harmful to a young mind's body image. A father from southeast England recalled the embarrassment his daughter felt after she, a 4'9" 10-year-old who partakes in regular physical activity, was called fat by the company's game. He told UK's Daily Mail, "She is solidly built but not fat. She was devastated to be called fat and we had to work hard to convince her she isn't. I know it's just a game, but we already have to worry about young girls starving themselves to look like magazine models, and now we have a game that tells them they're fat. This to me is very worrying." Many claim the game is simply not suitable for children, with measurements being conducted through Body Mass Index or BMI, a numerical indicator that measures body fat based on height and weight, though it's only really used to measure these factors for adults and not children. Even for adults, BMI shouldn't be taken as gospel, being only a rough calculation, as it has no real way of measuring an individual's muscle mass. Nintendo's response to the incident was that they wouldn't apply warnings to the game's materials as many had requested. A spokesman for the company said, "Nintendo would like to apologize to any customers offended by the in-game terminology used to classify a player's current BMI status as part of the BMI measurement system integrated into Wii Fit. Wii Fit is still capable of measuring the BMI for people aged between 2 and 20, but the resulting figures may not be entirely accurate for younger age groups due to varying levels of development." Our most recent case of controversy for Nintendo comes from the Switch, and it's one that, to many players, has likely been a cause for concern. The console's Joy-Con controllers are part of a class action lawsuit in the US after thousands of users reported issues of drift, with the controller's analog stick registering false inputs. Nintendo president Shuntaro Furukawa acknowledged the situation and provided a response during a Q&A session, though didn't exactly admit the company was at any fault for their faulty hardware. In June of 2020, he stated, "We apologize for any inconvenience caused to our customers regarding Joy-Con. We will do our best to ensure that our customers can use our services and products with peace of mind." This came across to many, myself included, as a non-apology. Furukawa claims that due to the lawsuit, the company cannot directly comment on the issue at hand. The lawsuit alleges that the controllers have design faults that stem from extensive wear on the pad's surface resulting from steel brushes inside the controller. The suit explains that to repair this issue, owners of a Joy-Con would need to pay for the repairs despite the issue being a manufacturing fault. and in some cases, the fixes are not adequate. The latest on this particular case is that it has been referred to arbitration, meaning an unbiased third-party arbitrator will be assigned to settle the case outside of court. However, Nintendo's Joy-Con woes don't stop there. In September of 2020, it was revealed that French consumer organisation UFC Coup Choisir are launching a fresh complaint over the drift in the controllers, claiming planned obsolescence and anti-consumer practices. A spokesperson for the non-profit organisation said, "The nature of the failure, how frequently it occurs for players, the limited lifespan of the product, and the manufacturer's inertia despite being informed of the defect. These are all characteristics of planned obsolescence practices at Nintendo." The lawsuit, filed in the French commune of Nanterre, hopes to change the way the controllers are manufactured to ensure better customer satisfaction.
Hello and welcome to Did You Know Gaming Extra. Today we'll be talking about weird Nintendo games that were officially licensed but not developed by Nintendo. Nintendo as a company are known for having a somewhat tight grip over their intellectual properties, but on occasion they've licensed their series to other developers. In recent years this can be seen with titles such as Hyrule Warriors, but Nintendo had made a number of deals which in hindsight they likely regret. Almost everyone knows the original Donkey Kong for what it is, a hit game that spawned a decades-long franchise and resuscitated the video games industry. However, you may not know that Nintendo actually licensed a near-carbon copy of the game. Nintendo was struggling to meet demand of Donkey Kong cabinets, and allowed the company Falcon to develop a modified version of the game to help boost their supply. Crazy Kong was designed to run on modified Crazy Climber arcade boards, and even included a number of sound effects from the game when Jumpman runs and jumps. The game also lacked any mention of Nintendo. One condition of Nintendo supplying the license to Falcon was that these cabinets must be made and distributed exclusively in Japan. However, due to the worldwide popularity of Donkey Kong and delays in production, many of these Crazy Kong cabinets started to surface not only in Japan, but in the US and Europe as well. It wasn't long before this flagrant breach of contract came to the attention of Nintendo, who promptly filed a lawsuit against Elcon Industries Incorporated, an arcade hardware manufacturer based in Michigan that sold Crazy Kong boards. This case was swiftly resolved in Nintendo's favor. Falcon also produced a sequel called Crazy Jr., a clone of Donkey Kong Jr. This was done without permission from Nintendo, however, and was met with legal action in the form of a criminal complaint. This led to the arrest of Falcon's president, and was the first recorded arrest related to video game copyright in Japan. Surprisingly, even Super Mario Bros. Had a port resembling a bootleg. Super Mario Bros. Special was developed by Hudson Soft and released for the NEC PC8801 and Sharp X1 series of computers in Japan, and later for the Samsung SPC 1500 in South Korea. Though the game strongly resembles its predecessor, the inferior hardware of the PC88 and Sharp X1 meant the game's graphics and audio are both noticeably lacking when compared to the original Super Mario Bros. Game. These versions also did not feature Luigi or a multiplayer mode. The most obvious difference in gameplay is the lack of fluid screen scrolling. In the Sharp X1 version, the developers adopted a Zelda-style screen scrolling, having the screen slide over and lock into place when the player reaches the edge. Whereas on the PC88, the screen simply cuts to black while the next section is loaded. Super Mario Bros. Special features all new and unique levels, making it the first officially licensed follow-up to the original Super Mario Bros. Title, releasing in Japan shortly before Super Mario Bros. 2, known as the Lost Levels in the West. The game features several enemies from the arcade Mario Bros. Game, such as the Sidesteppers and Fighter Flies, though under different names. There are also a number of additional power-ups and items in the game, most notably the hammer power-up from Donkey Kong and Hachisuki, also known as Hooby, the Hudson Soft logo, which awards the player with 8,000 points. Though you may be surprised that Mario had officially appeared in PC games of questionable quality, you may be even more surprised that Pokémon is in the same boat. The Pokémon trading card game swept the world, becoming popular with players and collectors alike. There was even a PC release based on the card game, developed by Fluid Entertainment, published by Wizards of the Coast, and officially licensed by Nintendo. Pokémon Play It became notorious in circles for its terrifying CG host Julie that greets the player at the start of the game. However, its purpose was to teach the mechanics of the trading card game. The title allows the player to compete against Julie with a choice of 4 half decks comprised of 30 cards each: the fighting deck, the fire deck, the water deck, and the extra deck. The game is limited in that Julie will always use the fighting deck unless the player selects it, in which case she will select the water deck instead. The game was successful enough to get an updated release which swapped out the initial decks for 7 new ones and let players place cards on the bench before their first turn started. In this episode, we'll be looking at the dark sheep of Nintendo's modern lineup of systems, the Wii U. While the Wii U left many gamers unsatisfied, in retrospect the hardware was interesting and held its own, and it has a surprisingly well-rounded library of games. During an interview for an Iwata Asks segment in 2011, Satoru Iwata claimed that development of the Wii U began in 2008, only 2 years after the release of the original Wii, 3 years before the system's reveal and 4 years before it was ultimately released. While the console was considered a major flop for the company, many concepts from Nintendo's time working on the system can clearly be seen with the release of Nintendo's far more successful Nintendo Switch. With The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, some features were actually dropped altogether as a result of Nintendo wanting both the Wii U and Switch versions of the game to be more or less identical. During an interview with Game Reactor, producer Eiji Aonuma revealed that the team had regrets over holding back on some elements which could only have been possible using the Switch's HD vibration feature. He wanted to allow the player to experience the same touch as Link, such as holding certain objects and feeling a sense of how it may feel in the player's hands through vibrations. He said that it would add a sense of realism, but would have also required the team to work on scenes specifically revolving around this feature, something which would have been impossible to replicate with Wii U hardware. He also claimed that now this constraint isn't held over the team, and with the Switch continuing to develop well with audiences, they would be able to use this feature in their next Zelda release. However, whether this will happen due to the introduction of the Switch Lite, which has removed the HD Rumble feature, is yet to be seen. The Wii U initially had a lot of support from third-party developers, including Capcom. One of Capcom's offerings was Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate, an updated version of the Wii's Monster Hunter Tri. This version had a fair amount of new content, including a new set of quests. One of the new quests, called Avenge the Fallen Hunter, had a sly reference in its description, which reads, "My weapon bounced off its hide like a toy. That thing moved so fast. Before I knew it, I was not cold. The medicine man says it's just a scratch, but the pain, avenge my flesh wound." This seems to be a reference to the Black Knight from the movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which if you haven't seen it, you have to watch it, where the knight fights King Arthur and gets all of his limbs cut off, saying the lines,
"'Tis but a scratch." A scratch? Your arm's off!
And
just a flesh wound.
Ubisoft also gave their support to the Wii U at launch. Their first game for the system was Zombie U, which was actually a reimagining of one of Ubisoft's very first games, simply called Zombie. Similar themes and mechanics are used in both games, such as if the character's health is depleted, they turn into a zombie and roam the room they died in. The main difference is that Zombie was set in a mall, much like George A. Romero's Dawn of the Dead, whereas Zombie U takes place on the streets of London. Originally, Zombie U was planned to be a Raving Rabbids game on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 called Attack of the Killer Rabbids from Outer Space. It was then changed again to an arcade-style FPS Wii U game called simply Killer Freaks from Outer Space, before becoming the reimagining of Zombie. Another show of support for Nintendo, even though Nintendo funded it, came from Platinum Games, The Wonderful 101. The game's cast wasn't initially set to be an original lineup of heroes, but rather an all-star cast of Nintendo characters. The title's gameplay was envisioned as a way of satisfying fans of each character, with the assumption that players would be drawn more towards some of their favourite characters over others, which is why the decision was made to introduce all of the characters at the same time. This would allow fans to pick and choose the hero they want from the get-go. After The Wonderful 101 was shelved as a concept for some time, the decision was made to drop the all-star lineup, creating a new roster of superheroes in their stead. Director Hideki Kamiya decided to base some of the heroes on a number of characters from his earlier works. By completing a series of challenges, the player is able to unlock Wonder Bayonetta, Wonder Jean, and Wonder Rodan from the Bayonetta series. It's even possible to unlock Hideki Kamiya himself, who utilizes his sunglasses to attack opponents under the name Wonder Director. There are even references to Kamiya's earlier characters, such as Poseman, who doesn't just have a similar appearance to Beautiful Joe, but strikes many of the same iconic poses, and even has a move called Heroic Forever, similar to Joe's Beautiful Forever. Wonder Cheerleader is also based on Sylvia from the same series, with a gun named after her technique, Desperado. Moving back to Nintendo's own projects, while the WarioWare series moved away from its more recognizable format, Game & Wario served its usual purpose for Nintendo hardware, providing players with a variety of play styles that used the entire console's functionality. This concept of using the game as a demonstration was at the core of the title's development. Nintendo even initially planned to include the game pre-installed on the Wii U console itself, giving the audience a free piece of software to get to grips with the console's gamepad. With the game having been developed in-house by Nintendo, alongside another team working on Nintendo Land, it's unsurprising that some of the same code would be used across both games. The voice used by the Adventure King found in the Pirate Solo game, alongside several other minor characters, used a modified version of the voice of Monita from Nintendo Land.
Hello there, Brave One. I am the Adventure King.
Nintendo took real care with Monita's voice stylings, even changing the character's accent for PAL territories, giving her a British accent instead of an American one.
I am Monita, your park guide. I am Monita, your park guide.
Nintendo Land actually hid one particular feature. While many of the mini-games found within the digital theme park are exclusively touted as solo attractions, this doesn't mean they actually have to be played solo. If a second player makes use of a Wii remote, they are able to assist during gameplay. In Balloon Trip Breeze, player 2 is able to push obstacles and balloons. Yoshi's Fruit Adventure can be played by multiple players, with each additional player able to remove one piece of fruit from a stage. In Octopus Dance, a second player can restore lost hearts as well as interact with the game's background. For Donkey Kong's Crash Course, time bubbles can be created which slow down any moving objects, including the first player, allowing for more precise movements. Ninjas can be held and prevented from moving or attacking in Takamaru's Ninja Castle, and up to 50 obstacles can be removed from the courses of Captain Falcon's Twister Race. As you might expect, some Wii U games had mistakes in them, including Nintendo's own titles. With Paper Mario Color Splash, the company made a major mistake before release. On September 22, 2016, customers who pre-ordered a digital version of the title were given the ability to preload the game ready for its intended release date on October 7th, granting them immediate access on its day of launch. However, Nintendo managed to accidentally grant all of the players access to the preloaded data immediately, meaning that those who preloaded the game actually just fully installed it instead. This mistake was quickly fixed, with the preload being removed from the store within hours of the mistake being discovered. Xenoblade Chronicles X is another exclusive game that many consider to be deserving of more recognition. The game was actually slightly altered during international localization, in particular, the level of customization which could be made to the playable character. In Japan, the player had the ability to adjust a female avatar's bust size, though when released outside of the country, this feature was removed. That wasn't all, with the character Lin Li also having a particular outfit, a rather revealing bikini, removed from the game, likely due to her age being 13. When asked about the situation by Kotaku, CEO of Monolith Soft and executive director of the title, Tetsuya Takahashi, had this to say. As a developer, I do feel like it'd be ideal to be able to adjust content so that it's culturally acceptable, whether it's in the US or in the EU. For example, there was a discussion about the breast slider. Jokingly, I said, well, would it help if we had a crotch slider for the male? Obviously this was a joke, but they responded, obviously it's not going to work out. I do realize there's a cultural difference between what Japanese people think and what the rest of the world thinks. I think what's important is that we make sure that the end user who actually plays the game doesn't have a bad experience. If that change is going to help alleviate that, then I think we should definitely make it.
Did you know? In Mario Kart 8 and Deluxe, if the player goes to the water park track and waits near the Aqua Cups, a quiet tune can be just barely heard. This melody is actually from Super Mario 64 and plays in Big Boo's haunt in the underground merry-go-round. This track was clearly made with a lot of diligence, which can be seen throughout the entirety of Mario Kart 8's development. The game almost had racetracks where the player could drill their way underground. According to the game's producer, Hideki Kono, in Mario Kart 7 we had the glider and submersion in water, and so when we were thinking about new ideas for 8, we thought, well, since we did all that, why not put a drill on the karts and have them go through the earth somehow for subterranean racing? He goes on to say they ended up scrapping the idea in favor of making a new anti-gravity gimmick instead. But interestingly, a mining kart called the Drill Master made its way into Mario Kart Arcade GP-DX, which landed in Japanese arcades a few months before Kono's team wrapped up development on Mario Kart 8. Unfortunately though, none of the arcade game's courses were designed around a digging mechanic, and the drill was only for show. But in that same interview, Kono teased that throughout the series, ideas scrapped in development sometimes got brought back for future titles, implying there's still a chance underground drilling could debut in Mario Kart 9. After drilling was cut to make way for the anti-gravity mechanic, the Mario Kart 8 team implemented a sub-mechanic based on Japanese history and culture. For hundreds of years, Japanese kids played with spinning tops called beigoma. They'd use a string to send them spinning onto a canvas arena, and the beigoma that spun the longest and knocked the other out of the arena was deemed the winner. They were incredibly popular for centuries, but kids mostly lost interest in them after World War II, when newer, fancier toys came about. Here you can see the way beigoma spin and bounce off each other when they connect. This is exactly what happens in Mario Kart 8 when two racers bump into each other during anti-gravity, with both racers doing a quick spin and gaining a speed boost. Or as Mario Kart 8's director Kosuke Yabuki explained it, the spin boost idea comes from Japanese spinning tops. We thought that the sight of spinning tops bumping into each other as they whirl around was perfect for the behavior of karts in the anti-gravity areas. Players will need to come up with different strategies than those used for racing over normal track sections, so I'm sure this will create situations never seen before. Mario Kart 8's soundtrack was the first in the series with live music. Whether it was jazz, funk, or classic Nintendo tunes, the entire score was recorded live. Many of the musicians Nintendo hired were Mario Kart fans themselves, and knew far more about their instruments than the developers, so they improvised to make the soundtrack even better than Nintendo imagined. In a Famitsu interview we had translated, Hideki Kono recalled, "The musicians looked at the sheet music and played it on the spot. Many of them played Mario Kart, so it was easy to express what we were going for. For example, for Bowser's Castle, the sound chief said, 'Since this music's gonna be for Bowser's Castle, please make it sound evil.' And the musicians replied, 'In that case, let's really make the guitars twang.' And if there were any parts they didn't like or didn't go well, they redid it countless times. In the end, more than 3 hours of their performances made it into the game. Another rumored experiment was using 4-player split screen on the TV and a 5th player on the gamepad, a feature that Sonic Racing implemented 2 years earlier, and similar to the 5-player mode in New Super Mario Bros. U, but none of those features made it into the game, with Yabuki explaining, "I thought that for Mario Kart, playing with someone else on the same big TV screen gives the game a more competitive feel. Because of this, we decided to limit the local multiplayer to TV split screen, and have the development team focus their efforts on the graphics and 60 FPS frame rate. In the end, the only gamepad features they implemented were tilt controls, a minimap, off-screen play, and the most important feature of all, honking your horn." Hiding in the game's internal data, there are a few more clues about unused ideas and cut content. The data contains 4 images labeled Cup Icon DLC, the Egg Cup, Shine Sprite Cup, Boo Cup, and the Blue Shell Cup. 6 months after the game released on Wii U, the Zelda DLC added 4 brand new tracks packaged as the Egg Cup, but the other 3 DLC cups never got used. Well, at least not as of this video's publication. We should note that in an interview with Japanese outlet Famitsu, director Yabuki didn't rule out future DLC coming out for the Switch version. The internal data also has an unused icon for a Magikoopa, perhaps Kamek, who could also be found in early builds of Mario Kart 64, but got cut from the roster during production. Kamek's had some cameo appearances all throughout the series, then finally became a full playable character in the 2019 mobile game Mario Kart Tour, so at this point, it seems likely he'll make his way into Mario Kart 9, or possibly Mario Kart 8 Deluxe DLC if any more happens. Diddy Kong seems likely as well. When Mario Kart 8 released on Wii U, director Yabuki apologized to fans, saying, "There are some characters that appeared in previous Mario Kart titles, but unfortunately didn't make it into this game, such as Bowser Jr., Dry Bones, King Boo, and Diddy Kong. I really apologize to players who liked these characters in particular." Yabuki eventually brought all those characters back for the deluxe edition on Switch, except Diddy Kong, but Diddy later returned for the mobile game, and he's in some of the Mario Kart arcade games as well, so we expect to see his mainline series return sooner or later. Except for the arcade titles, which include characters like Pac-Man and Miss Pac-Man, Mario Kart's pretty much only featured characters from the Mario universe. According to Hideki Kono, that's because Shigeru Miyamoto had a secret rule limiting the roster. If they added more Nintendo characters, Miyamoto thought it wouldn't be Mario Kart anymore, it would be, quote, Smash Kart. But it was the addition of Miis that blew the gates wide open. In a 2013 interview with MTV, Kono said, "When we put the Miis in, Mr. Miyamoto was even kind of like, you know, aren't you crossing the line here? This doesn't exactly feel like Mario Kart." But you know, with the Mii being a basic part of the console, we were able to put it in, and have him actually play it to get his sign-off. It's still an unlock, you can't select a Mii from the get-go, so for some reason it doesn't exactly cross Miyamoto's secret line, but it kind of came close. But once the seal was broken, DLC and the eventual deluxe edition on Switch added characters from Animal Crossing, Zelda, and Splatoon, with seemingly no end in sight for the series' future. Kono's team also created 2 brand new characters, Baby Rosalina and Pink Gold Peach, the latter of which was created because Mario Kart didn't have enough heavy women. Of the game's 12 heavyweights, all of them were men except for Rosalina, who Hideki Kono had specifically asked the Galaxy team to make super tall so he could use her as a heavyweight in Mario Kart Wii. But Kono's team wanted one more for Mario Kart 8, and a lot of the game's developers were women, so they gathered them all together and said as a counterpart to Metal Mario, they wanted a Peach clone. The ladies in the office were asked what color she should be. The men were initially considering Gold Peach or Platinum Peach, but the women wanted Pink Gold Peach, and that was that. The day after Mario Kart 8 launched in 2014, a girl called Rizupikor posted a 27-second clip to YouTube and labeled it Waluigi vs. Luigi 1. When we talked to her, she said she uploaded it just to show one of her friends and never thought anyone else would ever see it. But someone else re-uploaded the clip one day later with the much more clickable title Luigi Ridin' Dirty, Death Stare in Mario Kart 8, and the Ridin' Dirty song laid on top of it. The video quickly went viral, racking up millions of views and spawning an entire subreddit dedicated to Luigi death stares. Seemingly everyone was sharing them, and they even made their way onto Fox News. The truth was that every character in Mario Kart 8 uses that same animation when they pass another racer, but Nintendo fans found it hilarious coming from Luigi, who's usually known for his timid and cowardly nature. When E3 rolled around a couple weeks later, Nintendo added Luigi's death stare to their show. Nintendo of America marketing staff told GamesBeat it was a collaborative effort with Robot Chicken. They came up with ideas and so did we, but they let us know, from a comedy standpoint, what they thought would work. There are different examples of when it's the right time for us to take something that happens organically and make it part of corporate messaging. It was a late addition and we thought we could pay homage to the fans. Another Luigi death stare was used in a Japanese commercial soon after, but now, after almost a decade later, the subreddit's been abandoned and the meme left to rest. But for a few short weeks in 2014, a Mario Kart clip only meant to be seen by one person took the internet by storm and became an official part of Nintendo history. Remember that attention to detail we mentioned at the start of the video? Well, there's one place where Nintendo's usual diligence took a rain check. The original Wii U version of Mario Kart 8 had a mode called Mario Kart TV, which allowed players to rewatch and share videos of their races. This mode not only has its own music, but also has Mii background chatter that can't be heard anywhere else in-game. In late 2016, YouTube user Harm believed this background chatter sounded a little too human and decided to investigate. After extracting the appropriate audio file, Harm discovered that the chatter was actually in English and had simply been sped up and reversed. The file seemed to be a stock recording of a public space like a cafe, with a handful of people chatting away for about 40 minutes. Harm listened to the chatter in its entirety and found that at one point in the recording, a woman can clearly be heard saying the following swear. You might be wondering how this slipped by staff, but since Nintendo is made up mostly of Japanese devs, it's understandable how a sound designer could have overlooked an English swear while adding assets to the game. And once the audio was flipped and sped up, the chances of anyone else catching it would have become almost zero.
Just come in, looming large, so who's gonna make a stand? 100 rangers are taking charge, the line is drawn in the sand. Knuckles crack in 200 very different ways, but each and everyone has got the same thing to say.
Released in 2013, The Wonderful 101 was a title made by Platinum Games in partnership with Nintendo for the Wii U. It was directed by famed Japanese creative Hideki Kamiya, the mind behind such games as Okami and Beautiful Joe. It was an action game where the player controlled a group of superheroes called the Wonderful 100, who must face off against an invading alien coalition named the Gethjerk Federation. To understand how the game came to be, we will trek through the history of its development, a story of unforeseen twists and turns from behind the scenes of Platinum and Nintendo. The origin of the collaboration between Nintendo and Platinum Games takes us back to around 2010. Platinum had not long since released its first games to commercial success and a warm reception among critics. These included Bayonetta and the Nintendo Wii exclusive Mad World. Their newfound success drew them a lot of attention from publishers around the world, including Nintendo. Hitoshi Yamagami, a producer at Nintendo's software planning and development division, began taking an interest in them. About 6 months later, Yamagami was introduced to the head of Platinum Games, Tatsuya Minami, by a mutual acquaintance of theirs. At some point during their conversation, it was agreed upon that Nintendo and Platinum should try working together. This was the beginning of a partnership that would continue for years to come. Returning to the Platinum Games offices, Minami tapped Hideki Kamiya to lead a proposal that would be presented to Nintendo for a new game. The type of game this would be was left to Kamiya, with Minami providing only vague guidelines. He wanted it to be a title which would encompass some of gaming's biggest all-stars, with Nintendo characters taking center stage. Kamiya decided that it would be an action game of some kind, but the idea of a crossover on this scale forced him to think outside the box. He didn't want a game where players would control one character at a time at different points throughout the story. This would make balancing screen time between various characters and franchises difficult, and Kamiya wanted each of these beloved icons to receive an equal level of representation. Born out of a desire to achieve this, he imagined a unique gameplay system that would have every character on screen simultaneously. Kamiya attributes books from his childhood as his inspiration for these ideas, the main one being Swimmy by Dutch author Leo Leone. This was a short story about a small black fish whose friends are one day swallowed whole by a large tuna. Swimmy travels the ocean and eventually befriends another group of little red fish. He realizes that they can survive if they stand up to the larger fish together. They learn to swim in formation and mimic the appearance of a larger fish to scare away the hungry tuna. As a child, Kamiya was excited by the idea of small, separate entities joining together to form something stronger. This conceit, he divulged in an Iwata Asks interview, was at the very heart of the project from the beginning. How it would manifest itself in his pitch to Nintendo was the suggestion that the various characters would come together to form giant shapes like a fist or a sword. Players would use these gymnastic structures to fight enemies and solve puzzles. One of the hypothetical scenarios that Kamiya proposed to Nintendo was a handful of Mario characters like Peach, Yoshi and Luigi holding onto each other in a chain to form a bridge. Mario could then walk over them to traverse a large gap between platforms. Kamiya called these maneuvers Unite Morphs, a term which was held onto and appeared in the game that was eventually released. Platinum Games employees are tight-lipped about the character lineup they were pursuing for their All-Stars game, especially with regards to non-Nintendo characters, but one idea that Kamiya himself was willing to share was that he wanted to include Captain Falcon from the Nintendo racing series F-Zero. He would have been able to arrange characters into the shape of a ship, the Blue Falcon. In the past, he's also mentioned that Link from The Legend of Zelda was another A-lister he wanted to include. All of them would have been led through their adventure by an original main character, a new hero that would have been introduced in this new game. In 2014, I contacted Kamiya via Twitter, who confirmed that this character didn't become the central protagonist of The Wonderful 101, Wonder Red, or any of the characters featured in that game. This mystery lead character, he said, is lost forever. That's because Nintendo wasn't interested in pursuing his all-star action game, citing concerns about the project's scope. They believed that a game filled with so many characters within the design framework Kamiya had presented was overambitious. He wanted each character to have their own unique Unite Morph, which in the eyes of Hitoshi Yamagami was a mistake. Some of his first words spoken at that meeting were, quote, "This is impossible. Platinum's gambit to gain access to Nintendo's classic properties failed. Kamiya went back to the drawing board." Around this same time, he had been shopping around another original game to publishers that he'd been wanting to do for the Nintendo Wii about dinosaurs. This project wasn't picked up either, leading him to revisit his ideas from the aforementioned All-Star pitch shortly thereafter. Whether this concept could have a future was uncertain, but Kamiya refused to give up on it, continuing to believe in the project's core ideas. Having been unsuccessful in securing well-known IP from other companies, the director considered replacing them with original characters of his own making. He envisioned a team of 5 superheroes, each donning costumes of red, yellow, green, blue, and pink respectively. They would transform and fight side by side, each with their own unique abilities. It would employ the same Unite Morph gameplay he had previously proposed to Nintendo. Then came the idea to up the superhero count from 5 to 100. Kamiya reasoned that a much larger group of costume heroes would produce more powerful and more comical imagery. The concept was influenced by Japanese superhero tropes like henshin, the notion of heroes undergoing transformation sequences to gain their power, which was popularized by shows like Kamen Rider. Kamiya had referenced these tropes in the past with another title of his, Beautiful Joe. At this early stage, however, the director had no set picture in his head for what the game would look like. It was only when he turned to Mai Okura, a Platinum Games artist, that it would start to take on its distinctive visual style. Having previously worked with Kamiya as the UI designer on Bayonetta, Okura was his first choice for the role of lead concept artist on this new project. Together, their vision for the game's appearance was forged, a look inspired by American comic books. The characters were proportioned cartoonishly with large heads, but everything had an intently dark edge to it. The first character sketched out was Wonder Red, who featured slightly more muted colours in comparison with his finished appearance, and carried realistic weapons like a machine gun, which were later left out. While Kamiya approved of the design, he offered a few suggestions, most notably that Red needed to have more hair. When it was decided that the wonderful 100 would be comprised of 100 named superheroes with unique designs, the team got to work with drafting up dozens upon dozens of options. Many of these never made it into the game. Among those cut were some with actual superpowers, including Wonder Telekinesis, Wonder Fire, Poison, Metal, and Stone. There were some joke characters, such as one based around the Platinum Games logo, a pterodactyl, a centaur, a zombie, an hourglass, and Satan. There were also some duo characters like Wonder Cat and Dog, Wonder Tiger and Tamer, Wonder Magician and Rabbit, and Wonder Circus. On top of that, they had ideas for more colour-based heroes that didn't ultimately join the main cast of 7. These included Wonder Brown, Orange, Purple, Gold, and Silver. Platinum Games insiders revealed to me that they once explored the possibility of using classic Sega characters as well. Concepts for Wonder Hedgehog and Wonder Fox characters were created, referencing Sega's mascot Sonic the Hedgehog and his sidekick Tails. As the concept art began to come together, so did a playable prototype which ran on PC hardware and was built around the Xbox 360 controller. Platinum was showing the game to multiple different publishers, although it was always their hope that Nintendo would want to pursue it for one of their platforms. At this early stage, the game was much slower than the eventual finished product and didn't yet have its elaborate combat system. The player could perform only a small handful of attacks, and just 3 of the combat Unite morphs had been implemented: Unite Punch, Gun, and Sword. In addition, the individual members of your party would automatically attack enemies close by using their unique weapons, a feature that was later scrapped. The Unite morphs worked very differently at this point in contrast with later builds of the game. The team had yet to come up with the idea of drawing the Unite morphs, so instead they were selected by toggling an icon on the screen with a button. According to Kamiya, this feature was changed simply because he didn't regard it as fun. The Unite morphs were all initiated by Wonder Red in this demo, regardless of type, unlike how it is in the final game where a different character will perform them based upon which morph is selected. You were able to recruit civilians with Wonder Masks, as you can in the release build, but since the aforementioned drawing mechanic had yet to be implemented, you had to interact with each one of them individually, unable to select more than one at a time. The demo was made in around a couple of months and was therefore quite basic. It used placeholder models of reptilian creatures for enemies, which according to Kamiya were pre-existing assets taken from the Platinum Games archives. Several months after presenting their initial pitch to Nintendo, Platinum returned to them with this updated proposal, with the core concept intact, but their concerns with fitting in so many characters from different franchises gone, Nintendo finally gave them the green light. According to a US Gamer interview with Kamiya, the game was tentatively being thought of as a potential title for the Wii. The Wii U had yet to be publicly announced, and initially Platinum Games wasn't in on the secret of its existence. It wasn't long before that changed. At an early stage in development, the Wii U, then codenamed Project Cafe, became the new home for Kamiya's latest brainchild, the wonderful 100. As the project was starting to get off the ground, Nintendo chose which members of its software planning and development division would be overseeing it. Hitoshi Yamagami agreed to come on board as its producer and wanted his colleague Shingo Matsushita to join him due to his love for action games. He had previously supervised the creation of such titles as Sin and Punishment's star successor. Matsushita had one big reservation about joining the project, however. He believed that its dark art style would limit its appeal among younger audiences. Nintendo's other staff were in agreement on this. The art direction needed to be adjusted. How they would present this demand to Platinum became the subject of rigorous discussion during internal meetings at Nintendo. They had heard that Platinum's developers were very particular about creative choices like these, and were therefore very cautious about upsetting them. They were especially concerned about offending Hideki Kamiya, who had previously made Beautiful Joe, which used a very similar style of visuals to the wonderful 100 prototypes. Ultimately, they decided to be straightforward with them and tell them it would have to be altered. Kamiya was less than pleased upon hearing the news. He had held concerns about working with Nintendo from the offset, expecting they would restrict his creative freedom and enforce unwanted changes upon his game. When he was told about Nintendo's suggestions, he began to think that his worst fears were being realized. In his own words, he complained to his producer Atsushi Inaba like a child. Eventually, Kamiya came around to the idea of a brighter, more colourful look and embraced it as a positive change. As time went on, the game's stories started to take shape. Kamiya decided that the wonderful 100 group would be led by 7 main characters: Wonder Red, Blue, Green, Pink, Yellow, White and Black. The designs remained largely the same throughout development, although we can see a few small revisions that were made over earlier concept art. Wonder Black was once slightly taller, and there were some tweaks made to Wonder Green's weapon, to name a couple. Originally it was drawn as a more realistic looking sniper rifle, before being changed to a more comic alternative that more closely resembled a toy gun. Around this time, Kamiya introduced the idea of giving Wonder Red an evil lookalike with similar abilities to his, who he would fight throughout the story. This would eventually become the character of Prince Falcon. Earlier documents referred to him simply as Rival, since they had yet to settle upon a name. In the past, Kamiya has described earlier versions of the game in somewhat critical terms. In a couple of instances, he has been known to outright label these builds as boring and not fun at all. As a result, the gameplay was forced to change in some fundamental ways on its road to release. The game's existence was revealed to the public shortly after Nintendo's press conference at E3 2012 under the codename Project P100. At the time, the team had still yet to resolve a number of key issues that Kamiya had with its combat. In the demo, it was restricted to a few Unite morphs and a mechanic which was being called the Rush combo. This light attack essentially commanded all members of your party to rush towards an enemy and attack them en masse before automatically returning to rejoin the leader of the group. The Rush combo was later cut after this first showing, and is indicative of the game's more simplistic nature at this stage in development. It lacked an important component of combat in the release version. There was no way for characters to attach themselves to enemies and restrain them. In the final game, the Rush combo was dropped in favour of a mechanic allowing you to do just that, called the Team Attack. By pressing the X button, a portion of your party can zoom towards an enemy, latching onto them. The enemy slowly takes damage from being repeatedly hit by them, and if enough wonderful ones are holding onto them, the enemy becomes temporarily immobilized. This gives your leader the opportunity to attack them separately using Unite morphs. After the Project P100 demo at E3 2012, a number of stylistic alterations were made to the game. Originally, the leader of your group would have had manga-style speech bubbles appear above their head when issuing commands, with words like rush and go. This small feature was dropped shortly thereafter. The enemy ID cards seen whenever the player encounters a new enemy type were given an overhaul too. In the P100 prototype, these used different fonts and colours. They also used to specify which material the subject was made of, but this was later replaced by the location where they were first encountered. Furthermore, the name of each enemy was changed to be spelled phonetically. Another key difference in the art of P100 is the early version of the Wonder Pendants, the badges on the suits of each hero, which appeared in the shape of a mask here. The revised badges from the final game, which have a W on them, can still be spotted by eagle-eyed viewers in the 2012 demo, however. On the ranking screen shown after each section, the wonderful ones can be seen sporting the updated pendants. This small tease seemingly went unnoticed until after the game was released. In the year following its first showing at E3 2012, the game would evolve considerably, and its title would become set in stone. Originally, it was thought that its name would not change from the wonderful 100 until producer Hitoshi Yamagami expressed concerns with the number 100 being forgettable. He suggested 101 as an alternative, to which Kamiya agreed, since coincidentally, it would neatly tie into one of the final cutscenes he had been writing, in which the team find their 101st hero. The game was set for release in August 2013, but with only several months remaining until this deadline, Kamiya was still not entirely satisfied with its gameplay. One of its most crucial mechanics, which allows the player to execute multiple Unite morphs simultaneously, wasn't introduced until May 2013, just 3 months before launch. There had been repeated conversations among the development staff about implementing such a feature, but it had been held back by fears of putting too much stress on the engine and causing performance issues. Producer Atsushi Inaba in particular was skeptical of whether or not it could be done, saying, "Just thinking about all the secondary problems it would cause just made my head spin." With time running out, Kamiya took it upon himself to cut through the bureaucracy and politics typically attached to making such a big change, and ordered his staff to build it in. He ignored Inaba's advice and bypassed Nintendo completely, adding it in without consulting them while their producers were otherwise engaged. In an Iwata Asks interview, Nintendo's Shingo Matsushita recalled his fury at discovering this. "I hadn't been angry like that in a while. I was like, how could you do that now?" The risk involved in this decision was potentially huge, and could have introduced enough technical problems to necessitate delaying the game. However, the addition was made fairly painlessly. Kamiya realised that the work they had already done on their multiplayer mode made having multiple Unite morphs in the story mode much easier. It also elevated the combat in a big way, he felt. That gave the game polish. Nintendo really looked after us ever since the period when the game wasn't fun at all, so I wanted to do my best for them, even at the last minute. Yamagami agrees with the director's impulsive choice in retrospect. It made it a much better game. Because of it, the players are able to do a lot more, he said. Kamiya has expressed his satisfaction with the final product, although there is at least one feature of note that he regrets not being able to add: Miis. "We tried to make it possible to join your own Mii with the wonderful 100 as a hero," Kamiya tweeted. "We hope we can do it in the wonderful 102. In the end, Platinum Games persevered and were able to meet the game's deadline of August 2013. The developers fought through times of uncertainty, when even their own director didn't think the game was fun. It received positive reviews, although it was not able to meet Nintendo's sales targets, becoming one of the lowest selling first-party Wii U titles. Despite that, the game has earned a passionate cult following, and Platinum Games continues to believe in the IP. Its initial failure didn't deter Platinum from pursuing other ways for the wonderful 101 to live on. On February 3rd, 2020, a remastered version of the game for Nintendo Switch was successfully crowdfunded on Kickstarter within less than 20 minutes of its launch. One of the hottest properties to emerge from Nintendo's experimental foray into two-screen gaming, the Wii U, was Splatoon. Despite hardware sales falling well short of forecasts, Splatoon, a fresh IP, emerged as one of its strongest selling titles. Its quirky mixture of ink-based combat and trendy humanoid squids proved a hit and the foundation for a new series. While Nintendo itself has described its origins in detail, this is the story of a previously unknown original Nintendo game that once could have taken its place, that some believe may even be connected to it. Before Splatoon's earliest of prototypes, Nintendo intended to bolster their feature lineup with a brand new first-party shooter and looked to a team of developers with experience in the genre to realize it. 2011 saw Nintendo setting themselves up for the generation ahead. Their next home console, codenamed Project Cafe, was on the horizon, and so preparations to build its lineup of games were well underway. They sought to assemble a diverse first-party portfolio catering to a variety of different tastes. One genre they did not have covered, however, was shooters. With the Metroid Prime series on ice, Nintendo lacked an exclusive first-party shooter of any kind, something that had not gone unnoticed by their higher-ups. To rectify this, the company widened their search for a development team beyond their own studios. In March 2011, they tapped a third-party developer that had caught their attention in recent years. High Voltage Software had risen to prominence during the Wii's life cycle for championing the system and attempting to produce ambitious content for it that was geared towards core gamers. This began in 2009 with their original IP, The Conduit, a first-person shooter about uncovering an alien conspiracy. The game garnered no shortage of attention from the press, giving High Voltage an outlet to sing the console's praises and talk up their extensive plans to support it. In the short term, this strategy paid off for them. Some mixed opinions among critics didn't deter Wii owners from buying The Conduit and making it moderately successful. However, the company's fortunes would change for the worse over the 2 years that followed. Shortly before The Conduit was launching, they debuted another brand new property, The Grinder, at E3 2009. This horror-themed co-op shooter attempted to capitalize on The Conduit's hype, but ultimately failed to make it to market. Publishers weren't interested in funding it, despite High Voltage developing demos for 3 different potential versions of it. It was a costly experiment that ended up going nowhere and being shelved. Next came a sequel to The Conduit that also struggled behind the scenes. Financial issues had led to layoffs at the studio, which severely disrupted its development. With its sophomore entry suffering from numerous issues, the future of the series was cast into doubt. But as Conduit 2 neared its release date, an unexpected new opportunity arose for the Illinois-based developer in March 2011. According to several sources linked to High Voltage, Nintendo contacted them, expressing an interest in them developing an original first-party IP together. The game would be made at High Voltage Software by their staff, with Nintendo's oversight and funding. This proposal was the outcome of a strong relationship between the two parties. High Voltage had been developing exclusive original content for the Wii from the start, and this loyalty hadn't gone unnoticed at Nintendo. As far back as during work on the first Conduit game, they were providing the developers with early access to prototypes for technology like the Wii Motion Plus add-on. Early into their dialogue about producing this new game, Nintendo presented a vague outline for the project. According to members of the team that worked on it, they wanted a shooting game that the whole family could play. Their desire to create this style of game in particular was why High Voltage had been chosen for the task. They not only had experience in working on shooters, but also technology for making them already custom built for Nintendo hardware. As for their decision to target a broad family audience with the game, as opposed to more traditional fans of shooters, an ex-employee believes that Nintendo had identified a gap in their lineup, as well as the wider market, for a more accessible type of shooting game. How would they make this shooter for everyone? Nintendo had an answer to that as well, or rather the germ of an idea they thought High Voltage could expand upon themselves. Very simply, their suggestion was water guns. As opposed to conventional pistols and rifles, water guns would provide an alternative that would be less intimidating for family audiences. The rest, however, was up to High Voltage to figure out. Their creatives were left by Nintendo to determine how they would contextualize why water guns were being used in this game's world and which characters were using them. a small group of no more than 10 people was chosen to tackle this conundrum. The team, mostly a combination of designers and artists, would be led by Chief Creative Officer Eric Nofsinger and Art Director Matt Corso. This duo was notable for leading the developer's biggest projects at the time, including both Conduit games as well as their ill-fated title The Grinder. From the beginning, it was being envisioned that their Nintendo project would follow in the footsteps of those games by being a first-person shooter. Between the members of High Voltage, it didn't take long for ideas to form about the characters in this world and why they would be using water for combat in the first place. Their concept was all about robots, mechanical beings that were susceptible to blasts of water which could fry their circuits and destroy them. During the fairly short period that the project was in the works, concept art was produced to illustrate some of these ideas. Unfortunately, much of what was made has since been lost, but a former artist from the studio agreed to recreate some of their work-in-progress concept art from it for the purposes of this video. According to them, the team was pulling inspiration from a variety of sources to realize the look of the game. Their characters were partly informed by designs from the Mega Man series and the 2005 animated movie Robots. The environment, on the other hand, looked to one of Nintendo's own titles, Super Mario Sunshine. With distinct similarities to one of that game's levels, Peanut Park, the world of High Voltage's game had a theme park style to it with water at its heart. One piece of art conveys the aesthetic they were aspiring towards, a crossroads between nature and machinery. Water was central to the game's premise, and that manifested itself in a more literal sense throughout its setting. We would have seen streams of water flowing through levels, with transportation powered by hydraulics. There was a sense that water was not only a means of war, but something that somehow fueled all facets of life for the robots inhabiting these lands. The robots themselves were planned to come in many different shapes and sizes. Some had wheels or extending arms, others had water guns literally bolted onto their bodies. There were also robots that would use everyday items to aid themselves in battle, like this one wearing a raincoat for protection. Water guns weren't the only weapons planned to be made available either. They were developing ideas for guns that used other liquids. One they had considered was a bazooka made from repurposed PVC pipe that would launch sewage. There was a weapon cobbled together from a chemistry set that fired hazardous chemicals, and a gun that could spray electrified water onto the battlefield. At the time, the game was not being thought of as a potential multiplayer juggernaut like Splatoon. While multiplayer had been discussed, they were more focused on nailing their core concept first. Some of the developers I was able to speak to about the Untitled project believed that it was set to move forward, and that Nintendo's interest in its concept was genuine. However, it was less than a month into this early form of pre-production when relations between High Voltage Software and Nintendo took a turn for the worse. On April 10th, 2011, word that the two were working together was leaked online by a High Voltage Software employee. This worker shared some details about their dealings with a popular Nintendo news outlet. What this site then posted was a list of rumors from them, including the claim that High Voltage had been sharing water assets with Nintendo for a new game. For the brief period it was available online, the article was dismissed by many as baseless, but behind the scenes, it had sent High Voltage into a panic. The studio had a leaker in their midst, and this was a major problem. The news had not escaped the watchful eye of Nintendo either. Their higher-ups were soon informed, and the company issued High Voltage with an ultimatum. High Voltage would need to learn who was responsible for this information getting out, and ensure that no further leaks would occur on their part. What followed was an extensive internal investigation to unmask the culprit. The article was swiftly pulled at the company's request, and each of their employees was spoken to individually. According to former workers, they were given assurances that they would not be fired if they came forward as the perpetrator. High Voltage refused to nominate a scapegoat and throw one of their own under the bus for the sake of the project's continuation. Despite their efforts, nobody claimed responsibility for the leak, and it would forever remain a mystery among High Voltage staff. During my own investigation into the events, I was able to pinpoint the source of the leak and discuss it with them directly. From speaking to the alleged leaker and others who were in contact with them at the time of the incident, I was able to determine that the leak was carried out maliciously, an act of defiance in response to what they believed were unsatisfactory working conditions they had experienced at High Voltage. Since the company was unable to pinpoint the source of the leak, Nintendo's higher-ups felt they had no choice other than to discontinue their project. Former developers from High Voltage say that Nintendo needed assurances that anything they were working on together would remain confidential. With an unknown leaker encroaching upon their negotiations at such an early stage, confidentiality was not something High Voltage could promise them. This was the end of the road for their short-lived first-party Nintendo project. What would have been a dream contract for many of those working on it lasted around only a month in total. Just days after this, the company launched Conduit 2 and faced further hardships. The game was nowhere near as successful as the original, selling poorly around the world. It marked the last project they would have published by Sega. Ex-employees claim that some internal pitches for Wii U games were made, but none of them moved forward. The failure of Conduit 2 and the demise of their Nintendo project in some ways spelled the end of the company's love affair with Nintendo hardware. They began to focus more on Xbox and PlayStation platforms, working on such games as Saints Row: Get Out of Hell. In the years after their robot shooter project, rumours swirled around High Voltage that Nintendo had intentions of taking the core idea of a water gun game and developing it internally. 3 years later, when Splatoon was announced, many of High Voltage's staff believed that what they worked on back in 2011 was a far removed, early incarnation of those same basic ideas. According to Nintendo, Splatoon was born out of a 10-person team that produced a plethora of different game concepts in the search for a potential new IP. A prototype for a game where players controlled blocks of tofu emerged as the favourite. Players had to spray ink to cover as much ground as possible, and the team to cover the most turf would win. This was an early demo for what would eventually become Splatoon's Turf War mode. Nintendo itself has never acknowledged High Voltage Software's project, and neither companies have discussed it publicly. High Voltage declined to be a part of this video. For some developers, memories of the project are bittersweet. One source from the team expressed regret over not being able to make the game, but admitted they might never have been able to measure up to what Nintendo later accomplished with Splatoon. On the subject of the leak that brought the project down, they had this to say: "This happened 7 years ago, and the company is a third the size, with 80 to 90% turnover since then, and the fallout still weighs on the studio. I totally understand the ire of the person that leaked, but rather than sticking it to management, they screwed everyone at the studio for the better part of a decade." After a year or two on the market, support for Nintendo's Wii U console famously began to dry up somewhat. Due to a combination of factors like hardware power and sales performance, games from third parties became increasingly hard to come by. One of the system's biggest supporters earlier on, in 2012, had been Ubisoft. Before it was released, they had originally pledged a number of exclusives to the Wii U like Rayman Legends, Rabbids Land, and Zombie U. Although as time went on, the company's enthusiasm for the console faded. They were devoting less resources to it, and some of those Wii U exclusive games were ported to other platforms. Ubisoft hadn't given up on Nintendo's machine entirely though, as noted by their CEO Yves Guillemot in 2014. Speaking to Polygon, he revealed they had an unannounced game for Wii U that was completed and awaiting release. For a time, fans avidly speculated about which game this was, but as the months went by, there was no announcement to speak of. The project's release never came, and its identity was never officially disclosed by Ubisoft. With an investigation that will take us into the heart of the company, I'll be sharing with you a look at this game and why it was finished but never released. Ubisoft's aforementioned Wii U game came to be back in 2011. The industry was entering a transitional period as the next generation of consoles beckoned. Nintendo was first in line for a hardware update, winding down on its hugely successful Wii and preparing to usher in its successor, the Wii U, codenamed Project Cafe. Ubisoft had taken a liking to the console, privately pledging a number of games to it and letting their teams run wild with the possibilities of its centerpiece, the gamepad. With new innovations come new IP. Wiis, and Ubisoft was looking to their Paris branch for one that would properly take advantage of the new controller. The studio had seen plenty of success on the Wii as they shepherded the Raving Rabbit series and were responsible for Just Dance, placing them high in Ubisoft's estimation. A key figure at Ubisoft Paris throughout all this was Nicholas Normandon, who had been with them since Rayman 3 Hoodlum Havoc in 2003. When the publisher found itself searching for new games to join their Wii U lineup, Normandon was quick to step up to the plate with ideas of his own. Ubisoft had been looking for projects that would be built around the system's two-screen setup, but up until that point, solid ideas about how to do that were in short supply. One of the only projects going that did plan to fully take advantage of the gamepad was Ubisoft Montpellier's first-person shooter Killer Freaks from Outer Space, which used gyro aiming and off-TV play. Normandon's concept took a very different approach from Ubisoft's other Wii U projects. It was a multiplayer game based around social interaction with the gamepad at its core. Generally speaking, the idea was that it would be a series of games about how well you know the people you're playing with and what you secretly think of one another. Players would discreetly answer questions about each other on the gamepad's touchscreen. Eventually, the game would reveal the results of those answers in a surprising or humorous way on the TV. Its name was Know Your Friends. It was pitched to Ubisoft via an interactive slideshow presentation as opposed to a Wii U prototype. They were receptive to the ideas, however, and the project was quickly greenlit. It was planned to be a low-budget affair developed by Ubisoft Paris with a short production schedule. Nicholas Normandon was placed in charge of it. Early on in its lifespan, the Paris studio began to deliberate over which engine the game would run on. They were able to narrow it down to a number one choice, the UbiArt framework. They wanted the game to have a simple, approachable art style, and it was thought that hand-drawn art brought to life by UbiArt was the right way to go. At the time, UbiArt itself was still under development. It was being made by a relatively small team at Ubisoft Montpellier and would be showcased for the first time in Rayman Origins. It was garnering praise from all over Ubisoft, and it was expected that more games would soon take advantage of it. The Know Your Friends team at Ubi Paris hoped to be among the first to work with it and ask the Montpellier officers for access to it. However, according to former Ubisoft workers, this request was swiftly denied. They claim that during this time, some of Ubisoft's different branches had become intensely competitive with one another. The Montpellier studio had apparently grown protective of the new technology and therefore forbid the Know Your Friends developers from using it. This was despite the fact that Ubisoft Paris was actually already working with UbiArt. Just one floor below the Know Your Friends team, another group of people was supplementing the development of Montpellier's pet project, Rayman Origins. With the UbiArt framework off limits to them, the team had to rethink their art direction for the game. They soon arrived at the idea of a cutout art style, reminiscent of early South Park episodes. Almost everything on screen used cut-up pieces of real-life photography thrown together like a scrapbook, and character animations were directly inspired by the Muppets. As production got underway, the developers were able to further experiment with the capabilities of the gamepad. The title would join the ultimately short list of games to make use of its front-facing camera. Every time a new player joined the game, they could create an in-game avatar for themselves, and it would be saved as a passport for future use. The player would capture a picture of their face using the gamepad's camera, which would then be mapped onto a character in the game to represent them. It worked similar to Nintendo's Mii's in a sense, and the game would automatically fit your character into a variety of comical outfits and quirky animations. Every aspect of the game was designed to play upon social dynamics in interesting and usually humorous ways. Some questions would intentionally embarrass players, others would reveal more about their personalities and habits. Know Your Friends wasn't just about having prior knowledge of your friends, but also learning more about them as you played. In some of the modes, players would answer questions about themselves on the gamepad, such as their opinions on other people and their habits, before the others would have to correctly identify their chosen answers. While some of these questions were fairly friendly, occasionally the game might introduce something more probing and potentially awkward, like asking players for their honest opinions on goods manufactured under poor working conditions, or if they've ever accidentally hit an animal while driving. The next player would then have to guess their answer, and at the end of each round the game would reveal how well you were in sync with one another. The game included a wide variety of minigame formats and options to cater for different social situations. Players could opt for more family-friendly content, or an option for close close friends that would delve into more risque topics like alcohol consumption and sex. There were plans to possibly add more adult subjects like politics via DLC packs had the game released. Behind closed doors at Ubisoft, Know Your Friends enjoyed a warm reception, say former employees. Multiple playtests were conducted among staff outside the development team, including some Ubisoft higher-ups, to positive results. They found that the minigames had a quirky charm and humour that clicked with those that tried them. Soon the project was being hyped up internally as potentially being the company's next big thing. An employee from the development team claimed that Ubisoft's management was very excited about its prospects and believed it could even go on to rival the success of Just Dance. As a game made on a small budget, Know Your Friends would not have been a full-price title. Ubisoft believed that hitting that sweet spot in price, along with the right marketing approach, could result in a hit among casual players. According to Ubisoft sources, a large chunk of the game was done before the Wii U was even on sale. The vast majority of production on the title was apparently finished by the end of 2012. Further work took place throughout 2013, but one former artist suggests that had Ubisoft wanted to, they could have released it as early as the Wii U's launch in November 2012. Developers described the end of work on Know Your Friends as fairly unceremonious. There was no launch party to mark the milestone, since Ubisoft had yet to lay out their plans for how and when to release it. Convinced of its potential, the higher-ups wanted to wait and drop the game at a more optimal time for sales. At the Wii U's launch, Ubisoft was already focused on promoting Zombie U, a horror shooter built around the system's two-screen gameplay. This was another Wii U exclusive game like Know Your Friends that Ubisoft believed would perform well and possibly mark the start of a new series. Unfortunately for them, the optimistic internal sales forecasts for Zombie U weren't realised. The game flopped, much to Ubisoft's dismay. The whole ordeal left the company cautious of Nintendo's new machine. When sales didn't sufficiently pick up after the 2012 holiday period, they began revising their support for it. Rayman Legends was originally intended to be a Wii U exclusive launch game too, before it was pushed back to February 2013 to make further improvements. Fans were eagerly awaiting its release when less than 3 weeks before launch, Ubisoft announced they were delaying it a further 7 months. The game would no longer be exclusive to Wii U, now arriving on Xbox 360 and PS3 as well. In the middle of all this was Know Your Friends, a game now stuck in a post-production limbo state. As console sales fell in early 2013, Ubisoft continued losing confidence in Wii U. They had grown skeptical of its viability as a platform and their ability to sell games on it. Consequently, the decision was made to indefinitely postpone the release of Know Your Friends until the situation improved. Ubisoft hoped that Nintendo could work to drive up hardware sales themselves and that the platform might become more profitable for them in the long term. The developers that worked on Know Your Friends were told that its release was on hold, but it was just a matter of time before Ubisoft would start rolling it out. As the months went by, however, it became apparent to its creators that time was possibly never coming. Some people from the team are said to have campaigned for its release inside Ubisoft in the years after it was finished, although, according to a former artist, Ubisoft's marketing division prevented it from moving forward. Sources from the company claimed that the marketing department was given autonomy from the Paris studio to determine when and if to release it. They had originally intended to launch it in either 2013 or 14, but when their Wii U games failed to meet expectations, all of that was cast into uncertainty. Ubisoft's marketing was left to decide what to do with it, and eventually chose against releasing it. They didn't think that the console had been able to tap into the broader mainstream that the Wii did, and therefore didn't think there was an audience on it for Know Your Friends. They believed that reaching the audience the game was intended for would have been a costly task, including a TV ad campaign. Instead of risking another Wii U failure, the funds that would have been spent marketing it were used to push other games. As it became clear the Wii U game would never officially see the light of day, Ubisoft Paris briefly attempted to get it released on other platforms. They suggested a downloadable version on the PSN store, as well as ports for iOS and Android. The mobile version made the most progress, ex-developers say, receiving a playable prototype before Ubisoft shot down the possibility of developing it into a full game. After a lengthy internal battle over the fate of Know Your Friends, this was when any lingering hope for it was finally extinguished. Wii U sales never picked up to Ubisoft's liking, and thus their stance on the project remained unchanged. Know Your Friends was never officially announced, despite being completely finished and even receiving a rating from the ESRB. The vast majority majority of the team from Know Your Friends at Ubi Paris went on to co-develop the Nintendo Switch exclusive Mario + Rabbids Kingdom Battle. That game was produced by Xavier Manzanares, the producer of Know Your Friends. Nicholas Normandon, on the other hand, joined Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Wildlands as a senior programmer.